management. In day one, kind of did a high fly overview of what to expect and what you're actually trying to achieve in that process. Day two, we took care of kind of how to assess risk, right? So we went through the process of identifying, the threats and then vulnerabilities, and then mapping those to actual risks, so we actually know what we're dealing with as far as impact to our company. So today the goal is actually, we've got all these risks. We've got a pile of risks that we've got to deal with. We've identified with ourselves or in our client environments, and we got to figure out what we're going to do with that. And so today is all about how we deal with risk. So mitigating risk is essential for maintaining a secure and resilient environment, obviously, right? That's the whole purpose of doing the risk assessment. The first point, we need to figure out how we're vulnerable and how these threats can hurt us, what the actual impact to our business is. And one of the things that you have to do once you've identified these risks is figure out how you want to deal with them. And so there's four primary ways that you deal with risk. And you start. Okay, I'm going to start with avoiding. Avoiding is one where you've just determined that particular item is not worth the headache, not worth the cost, not worth the time. There's so much. Oh, by the way, I didn't even, Shel, I apologize. I didn't have you introduce yourself. I am so. Shel, would you mind introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah,
And
sure.
for the folks that watch it, especially the ones that, I think most folks here know you, but especially folks that watch this after the fact, I'd love to get that little introduction up before we get
Sure.
move any further.
Sure. Yeah. Shel Phillips, Covenant Technology Solutions and Covenant Global. I am a compliance consultant. I'm the yang of yin and yang of security. I'm the compliance side. I do all the documentation and compliance tick-offs for our clients. We are working a lot in the defense industrial base right now, and kind of focusing there. We do a lot. I do a lot of training for other MSPs in CIS 18 through PAX 8, and we're a guest on the Kamanja because we've adopted their GRC, and are looking forward to putting the tool to use and through its paces.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that, Brady. And just in case anybody is watching this out of order, I'm the channel director for Kamanja, Martin Perkins. About 12 years in MSP, so quite a few in which I ran MSP. So I kind of know where the MSP owners sit when they're making decisions and that kind of thing, and what the value propositions are. And then I've been in security and compliance for the last year and a half, So been with Kamanja since August. So anyway, back to the risk management. Sorry for that little tangent. I figured we might as well let them know who we're talking to. So back to risk avoidance. I mean, risk avoidance is maybe we don't store that data at all that we stored just for record keeping. Maybe it's we had some wireless features that we just, rather than deal with the risk associated, we're just going to turn those off. I know a lot of MSPs that are doing away with the enterprise Wi-Fi, dealing primarily wired, because most of the tools are using are cloud. So they're doing client isolated guest Wi-Fi networks rather than deal with the potential risks of enterprise. It depends on your configuration whether that even makes sense. But that's another example of avoidance is just completely avoiding or doing away with what that risk's associated with. Any other anything on that, Shel, that you might want to?
Yeah, I would think that avoidance is not necessarily just turning your back on a particular risk, but also taking steps to avoid it before it becomes a problem. In other words, harden your stack. Take other steps, bring in tools that are required to actually not have to deal with an imminent threat. And I would call that part of avoiding as well, but not just turning your back on it, but also acknowledging it and taking steps in advance to avoid it, if you will.
And to clarify, I want to make sure that I'm not talking about like turning your back on the risk. I'm talking about doing away with the source of the risk is more what I was trying to cover there. Degley, you had a question, sir?
Yes. So, and this is, I'm assuming this has to be well documented, right? If we're avoiding something because it's not worth the risk, we gotta document and specify as to why we're avoiding,
Right.
certain risks, right?
100%. I mean, obviously this risk would be identified during a risk assessment process, right? So it's going to be on your risk report. And so then if you've decided that we're just not going to have that function, or if we've taken steps to completely do away with that risk entirely, that would be something you'd have to document very well, 100%. Um, I'm kind of going to go counterclockwise on here because we're talking about mitigate last. Acceptance. There are certain risks that are just inherent and um, just a cost of doing business, if you will. So even after you've gone through and done a lot of these different steps, you're going to have what's called residual risk, and that's something that the Kamanja platform has the ability to track that as well. So when you're going through and looking at a risk assessment, you have both what the inherent risks are to that thing, and then what the residual risk would be long term, because everything that we use, like it or not, has risk. I mean, there's 0 days out there all the time that we cannot stop. Having a VoIP system has inherent risk. Having, my M365 has inherent risk, whether it be from a disaster, a downtime type component, or a threat actor component, or an internal misuse, or sabotage or something like that component. All these things have inherent risk, and so at some point, accepting risk is something that you just have to do. I mean, there's a certain level of residual that you've deemed tolerant, that you're willing to accept, and then that's when you would go to accept it. Anything else? Anything to share on acceptance, Shel?
It's the kind of thing that a client actually says, okay, we know there's risk there, but we'll deal with it. An example might be in a healthcare setting where multiple people use the same PC to access medical records, and rather than logging out and logging in each time, they say, okay, we'll have one login for the Windows environment, and then each individual would log into the EMR, for example. And so they've intentionally decided to accept the risk of the Windows login being a single sign-on or a single login, but then they rely on the application itself to sort of identify who's in, who's doing what, and so on.
That's a great example. It's a combination of things that we know aren't best practices, but based on impact of the business, that you just accept, and then accepting any residual risks that do go along with it. Um, the the third we're going to talk about is transferring risk, and this is there's a lot of ways to transfer risk, and I think this is going to be an entertaining one. I mean, I know a lot of individuals think of just getting cyber insurance is transferring of risk. There's a component of the risk that you're transferring there, which is data loss. Obviously, there's a whole slew of risks associated with data being infiltrated, exfiltrated, that kind of thing, that are completely separate from just losing it, right? You have your reputation at stake. You have what kind of information is being taken in that respect. But transference happens in a lot of different ways. I know a lot of people, rather than housing servers in house, opt to move to cloud-based systems and transfer that risk to the platform that they're using, rather than house all that data and the downtime that could be associated with it, depending on what kind of issue occurs in that respect. And so transference is one that it happens in a way. Do you have any other examples that might bring up, Shel, of what transferring risk might be?
Well, certainly anytime you use a third-party SIEM/SOC service, you're transferring some amount of risk to another party to take care of it. Some MSPs think that a signed waiver, actually transfers the risk to a client, and we're finding out anymore that if you're aware that there's a significant risk, and you have somebody sign away, oh, we're not gonna hold you accountable for that. one, it doesn't transfer the risk effectively, and two, it's you're actually accepting that there really is a risk there and something should be done, and so it's sort of a trap. The old risk waiver doesn't really any longer do what you would want it to do. So there's a lot of conversation around transfer of risk anymore. MSPs should consider themselves being in the same canoe as the client and take every effort to protect all areas.
And this might be slightly tangential, but as far as what are you seeing? I know you deal with a lot of MSPs. What are you seeing folks doing instead of the waiver? Are they having to fire clients based on some of these risks that are being retained, or?
That's a very good call out. Many do. I know that we fired some because they wouldn't, let's say they wouldn't use MFA or they just wouldn't follow the requirements that we lay down for them in order to be secure. And so, yeah, we had to actually hand them off. We didn't fire them. We handed them off to another MSP who would take the risk.
That's a much more diplomatic way to put it. Yeah,
Yeah.
when I was running my MSP, we had a substantive stack that we would not take on a client with. Legacy, we had to deal with a lot of these issues and trying to illustrate why, and we did use the waiver more as a sales tactic, more of a tool to emphasize just how dangerous the issue was, rather than that. But the long-term strategy was hand them off, right? Find another partner that was more suited for them.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, but exact same issue there. And so transference has a whole host of things you can do. Again, everything from just different components of risk, right? You can have, like I said before, data has a whole host of risks associated with it. Some of the risk can be transferred off to insurance. Some can be transferred to cloud services, depending on what things look like. But transferring risk is one way that you can deal with risks inherent to your organization. And then comes the kind of like the one that this is our bread and butter, right? This is where MSPs really live and swim in, is the mitigate or deal with the risk, right? Reduce the risk as much as possible. So mitigation is just that, is taking risk and reducing it to an acceptable level. Because again, at some point you have to accept risk levels. No one can do business with zero risk because there is no such thing as a zero risk business. And so mitigating down to an acceptable level is where a lot of MSPs are doing a lot. That's why a lot of folks are doing a lot of this work to begin with, is to get the roadmap laid out for their clients, to understand what the risks are, and so they can lay out a roadmap of what getting their primary risks dealt with and mitigated and secured looks like. And so risk, I'm going to go to the next slide real quick, because this is really all about mitigating risk. And this is just an example of a mitigation process, right? So you have risk statements. You have a clearly articulated risk. Say my risk is unauthorized access to my data, right? That's that. I have very sensitive data. I have PII, whatever that might look like. And so the mitigation measures may very well look like implementing two-factor authentication, conducting regular access reviews, and encrypting sensitive data. Those would be the tools that would reduce that risk to something that I would find acceptable, right? You have your responsibility team who's responsible for making that happen, and in many instances, this is going to be yourselves, and that's going to be taking care of the implementing said controls. And by the way, one of the things that I want to emphasize here is, we're talking about technical controls a lot in this 3-day process, and Shel can attest to it. An enormous percentage of your control sets are going to be policy based, are going to be on the administrative side, on dealing with how people are taught to deal with data, and how you're enforcing those policies throughout the organization. Would you care to chime in on that, Shel?
Yeah, sure. To be fair, in CIS 18 and CMMC, NIST 800-171, about 50%, maybe a little over that, a little over half of all controls or practices are met by technology. the rest are some sort of procedural process, whether it's an example might be awareness training. That's not something you can do with a checkbox in a technology. You actually have to, schedule training, you have to provide content and so on and so forth, and there are vendors to do that. But about a little under half are procedural controls that you have to write something about and have to work with it. Now, all of the system security plan should identify and talk about all of the controls, even if they are met with technology. They should be identified within the plan and some form of purpose for that control, and then what technology is involved, what processes, what steps are taken at a high level. Now, the actual checklist is a procedural or a supporting policy document. But for the most part, each one of those controls should be identified in the security plan and then dealt with. But yeah, a lot of them are written. For example, when you're doing a background check, that's an HR process, and it probably has a checklist assigned to it. But none of it is security technology. It's the process, and so there's a supporting document for that.
Yeah, 100%. And I didn't want to cut you off. Were you going to say something else?
No, I was clearing my throat.
I was good. Because if you look at most of the big hacks, also here recently, I mean, everything from LastPass to the what was the phone carrier that I can't remember it off the top of my head, but almost every single instance was someone misusing company equipment, using it in a way that was in the face of what the company's policies were. And so, excuse me, having those out and enforced, and make sure that people are actually adhering to them, which it goes into the checking of controls. But having them in place is the first step, because if you don't have those policies in place, if you don't have company owned hardware rules in place, acceptable use policies in enforced, you really don't have any recourse when that person misuses it, because there was no guidelines for them to use it in the first place. And so a lot of these things are really are transference of risk onto the individual in a lot of instances as well. When you're talking about, hey, here's how we expect you to use our hardware. If you don't use it that way, now that's something that we've taught you, and we've documented that we've taught you, that kind of thing. So, and then in this mitigation example, that you have a timeline of actually taking care of that issue. So complete your two-factor authentication implementation, and so on and so forth.
Could you, Martin, could you maybe explain a little bit how Kamanja sort of fits into this process?
Oh, 100%. So as we go through, so again, just to reiterate for anybody that's not familiar, Kamanja works through the compliance framework process as we do a risk. It's basically coupling a risk assessment as we go through the compliance framework. So as you go through, say, a CIS assessment, you're doing a risk assessment alongside of it. And so once we've actually gone through the entire assessment, based on whether it's, if we're doing a CIS control set, an CSF, or if we're doing it for HIPAA purposes or whatever, we've completed a risk assessment as we go through. And so, and I'll show a little demo of how that works here in a minute, once we get more towards the end of the session. But you actually go through and take those risks and apply mitigation controls into that. So every risk that you identify has the ability to apply control sets and to apply risk mitigation to it, to reduce those risks down to appropriate levels. And so that there's a process there that you'll go through, and once you're done, you'll have, again, I think I mentioned earlier, that residual risk profile. So once you've gone through and applied all your risk mitigation, then you'll still be able to kind of see kind of where you stand based on what that inherent risk of those items are. And so you'll go through that risk assessment and mitigate those risks, and on the back end, you'll have a report showing where you started, what control sets and mitigation strategies you implemented, and then what your residual risks are on the out. Is that kind of what you're looking for?
The manager of the GRC has to do something. They can't just click a button and now all of a sudden you're compliant, right?
Correct. Yes, and so that's one of the things that compliance is work. I mean, there's a fair amount of effort that goes in, especially when it comes to documenting everything you've found. Right. That's going to be a massive lift when you're unpacking a client. Now, one of the great things about the way Kamanja does things is we're an ongoing risk management platform. So as the company grows, expands, adds employees, removes employees, as long as you've integrated that into your onboarding, offboarding process, you're maintaining an up-to-date risk profile of that client as you go. So you're not a lot of individuals or a lot of MSPs look at compliance as a large project to do the compliance assessment. Then they go through and get their security projects, and then next year they do it all over again. This is one way of maintaining, keeping a pipeline full of security projects, doing an effective roadmap for your client, because you have an ongoing risk profile for the client. And so that's really the more effective way to do it. And you're not having that at best half a year, 6, 7, 8 months, if you're doing it on an annual cadence of what has changed in the organization and what needs to be addressed. There's a whole lot that can happen in that time period. And if you're not on top of that, maintaining it proactively, you're going to miss a lot of things and expose the client to a lot of risk in that process.
The leverage comes from being able to assign responsibilities and tasks to other individuals who might have that responsibility, and then having a due dates and that sort of thing, and have it tracked.
Exactly. Yeah. And documentation is one of the other things that is having it all built into one system makes things really handy when you're going back through, right? So here's a task, here's who's responsible for doing the task, here's responsible for making the task, make sure the task was done as a owner, so on and so forth. And so it's really critical that you document a lot of these things, especially if you're doing any kind of, like governmentally instituted frameworks like CMMC or HIPAA or anything along that line. Having documentation, SOC 2 in particular, is very particular about how well you've documented all the components and the processes that you've implemented.
I'll tell you, for the last 3 years, tracking and mitigation have been my biggest challenge, because I've done it all with spreadsheets and Word docs, and my own scheduling process, however that works, whether it's in my CRM or some other, whether it's in Teams or whatever. That's been the challenge, is actually keeping up with, oh yeah, I've got some stuff to do, and what was it again, and documentation of all that sort of thing, and then keeping all the documents up to date, and so on. That's been a big challenge, and that's why I'm pretty excited about Kamanja.
Yeah, having it all in one place and having it housed next to the data and joined, attached to the data as you're going through it is really awesome. And one of the other things is, as you're going through, say, your risk management iterations, every report that you create based on new data and that kind of thing is revision tracked. So you can go back and look historically to see where you started, where and how far you've come in the process as well. And so that's another big benefit of having something like a GRC tool like Kamanja, to be able to track that and make sure that you're moving in the right direction. I mean, HIPAA is a big one on that, on making sure that you're not only documented and identified what the roadmap is, but you're making progress towards the goals that you've made as well.
CMMC is really big on revision tracking.
Excellent.
Big deal.
All right. And so one of the things that obviously that when you're talking about this, security best practices are going to cover a good amount. Not going to rephrase that. Are usually going to cover a large quantity of risk. I'm not talking percentage. I'm talking a large quantity of risks in general. So implementing things like access control, doing regular audits. That's a critical thing. And in conjunction with ongoing proactive ingestion of new assets and to include people and computers and other technologies that are coming down the pike, but also audits of process, make sure that you're actually, the controls that you've implemented are actually having the desired effect. I know that I think we talked about this kind of heavily in the second session, is right sizing your security, making sure that the controls you have in place are effectively addressing the risks that your client has. And it's very easy to put X number of controls in place and say, all right, I've got a very solid security stack in place. And that being said, the tools are going to be probably very, very quality tools. You wouldn't pick a bad tool to implement. That being said, if they're not configured correctly, or if they're not the right tool to actually cover your client's risk, that's where you need to be auditing the efficacy of your control sets and whether they're achieving the goals that you've set forth for addressing the risk in the first place. Employee training, obviously, that this is something that if it goes without saying, it kind of speaks itself. Cybersecurity training is something that I think I mentioned earlier when we talked about a lot of the big hacks that have happened were primarily, if not all, employee error. It was a brute force. It was a brute force MFA attack. It was someone using a laptop with software that was outdated. It was a software engineer that had a company laptop at home that had access to things it shouldn't at home, and they had a Plex server that was unpatched. It's this kind of training this is the only way you can address those kind of things, because employees, knowing what their security policies are and what the risks that they're up against are, and this is going to be critical. And then encryption across the board is obviously a no-brainer. You need to make sure that you have encryption in place, on all data that has any kind of sensitivity whatsoever. Any like in conjunction with compliance, any insight around best practices at all, Shel?
I think the biggest challenge for MSPs, and because I run into them the most, the hardest thing is doing regular reviews and updating documentation for training. Most of the regulated frameworks require not only just general cybersecurity training, but job specific training. In other words, if you're the network engineer, or you're the HR or whoever, each of those frameworks require that job specific training is provided as well. And so that's always a challenge for whoever's in charge of compliance, is to make sure that training is happening and that it's documented, and then it's specific to all the jobs that you have. And so that harkens back to when you get started, you have to identify all your roles within the company, identify the roles, identify their access, their access controls that you're going to put on them. Take away local admin. That's the biggest and hardest bummer for everybody, is, I can't throw my own tools on.
Mm-hmm.
Have to get permission. But access control is a big deal. And access control really applies also to the tools you use. It's not just access control to the client and for client stuff, but it's actually the tools that you use, your CRM or your SIEM/SOC or your remote access tools.
Mm-hmm.
They should have access control also. So when you're buying them, when you're purchasing them and evaluating them, you should look for least privilege within them too, and kind of look out for that. Encryption, yeah, there's standards for that, and there's a lot of good tools, BitLocker and that sort of thing, and TPM chips that are all being built in now to systems. That actually goes pretty well. But beyond that, in regulated frameworks, you need to make a special place for controlled unclassified information, for example, or PCI data, whatever it might be. You need to really think about how you're going to separate that and put it aside. So there's a lot of best practices. These are good general categories. There's probably others that should be investigated, and those all can be found online or in various forums. Talk to Cyber Matt Lee or watch some of their stuff. They'll be talking about all the different aspects. And but this is a great start.
Yeah, when you mentioned least privilege, when we had Matt Lee on the first session of this series, we were talking about how one of the challenges for MSPs, especially, and even pushing it down to their clients, was tool restriction, right? It's so much easier when all your techs have admin access to the CSP portal, right? Because then they can do whatever they need to, and you don't have to worry about jumping through any hoops. But that being said, it's an invitation for disaster, because your tool sets are a massive vector of potential attack for you guys, or even just error, right? Mishap, misuse, or mistakes that are being made. And so making sure that you're granting as little privilege as you can down stack as you can, so that people can actually do their job at the same time. They don't have access to resources they should not have. That's a challenging one. It's an even harder conversation to have with clients who are used to your point, pulling that remote or local admin. That's a very challenging thing with a lot of clients, because they're used to being able to do whatever they want to do on their machines. And so learning how to have those conversations is critical when you're going through these processes. So, all right. So we have a couple studies of case studies of successful risk mitigation. In case study 1, we're talking about potential data breaches due to weak access controls. And the mitigation measures were, we talked about adding two-factor, conducted employee training, and enforced regular access audits. And the outcome was to reduce the risk of unauthorized access, leading to improved overall data security. One of the things that I don't think I mentioned here is, we talked about policy or administrative controls. We talked about technical controls. You also have your physical controls that you're implementing as you go through these processes. So the cameras on the server room door and key fob door lock access, things of that nature. So you're documenting who's going into the server room, that kind of thing. Cameras so you can watch for tailgating, all that kind of stuff. All factors into, like, when we talk about access audits on who's accessing what. That's the kind of thing you're often talking about. So when you're talking up to your clients and developing these security strategies, make sure those are a component of it as well. The security aspect of it and validation of that, some way to vet the controls, because it's one thing to have a sign-in sheet next to the server room when people walk in. It's another thing to be able to validate whether or not that server that sign-in sheet's accurate, or if you're using fobs to validate, having a camera on there to make sure that tailgating is not occurring, that kind of thing. Case study 2, the issue that we're talking about is vulnerability in critical software component. The mitigation measure we discuss is regularly applied security patches and updates. And this is kind of ironic, because this is typically best practice. And for some reason, the VoIP platform that had the issue recently is eluding me. It's driving me a little crazy. But one of the issues that they had in their thing was, if you did update to the new software, it caused issues, and they had to fix their newest patch and re-roll it back out. But typically, rolling new patches is the way to go. Having the most updated patch version, and the outcomes mitigate the risk of potential exploitation and maintain system integrity. So, and these are very basic case studies. These are very streamlined, if you will. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? Any input? Any thing that all they want to bring up? Good, Shel?
Yeah. One thing we do with patches is we sandbox them before we actually put them out. We give them at least a week and see what the trades are saying about them, and do our own testing on them before we actually put them through the patch update process.
That's definitely a wise way to deal with patching. There are there's been historically quite a few patches that have had threat actors code in them that have come out that have caused issues. So sandboxing is definitely a great way to minimize that, or reduce that risk. Put it that way.
One other comment too before you go on.
Sure.
These case studies, the best practices, they're sort of generalized, and typically you would look exactly at what vectors were weak access, so on. What vectors did someone, a bad actor, come in on, or what was violated and in what way, and then work specifically on that. Just implementing two-factor, or just doing training, or just doing audits or whatever, those are good things, but they aren't always the solution.
Not a
Sometimes
comprehensive.
you have to look pretty deep and make sure you understand the nature of the breach
Well, and
or
that's a good
event.
point. I mean, yeah, when you talked earlier about access control, honestly, there's very few organizations that have developed an appropriate access control policy and implemented any kind of hierarchical, access,
Yep.
technical controls within the organization. So that honestly should be probably one of the first things you do, in addition to the things we talked about here.
Yep.
DLP practices. I mean, obviously that's built into most Microsoft. If you're Microsoft Premium, Business Premium or higher, you've got access to some DLP tools that allow you to alert on or prevent data from being shared. There's a lot of things in there that would fall into this. That's a great observation. Is these are very generalized in that respect. A proper way to look at it. Go ahead, Shel.
Yeah, the gotcha on that is while those capabilities are built into Microsoft platform, Microsoft does not turn them on as standard. You have to configure. It's like getting a erector set for Christmas. You don't have a crane until you follow the instructions and build the crane. You don't have security until you actually do the work to trigger all the right, like for example for DLP or for whatever. You have to actually put the policies in place. You have to figure out what they are. And there are some of us who have actually built checklists, configuration checklists to harden the Microsoft platform. Microsoft's a great starting point because it's got all the pieces that you need, but then it's again like an erector set. You have to configure it properly, and that's it's not just enough to say, oh yeah, I've got business premium. Okay, that's good. That's a good start, but you have to know how to configure it as well.
Oh, 100%. And there's so many tool sets in there that are not even aware of. And I remember there was a patch that got pushed through that with some defaults that changed, how information is shared. And so those are the kind of things you got to be consistently unaware of too, because you can't just run through and do a hardening process, because that's something that I've had a lot of partners do, is they would run through that hardening process and say, ha, we're good. And they weren't doing audits, and Microsoft pushed out a patch that restored a default or something like that, and all of a sudden they had stuff open to the world or whatever that looked like. So it's you continually not just knowing how to configure, but also continually reviewing those policies is important.
And I mention that not for the gentleman on the call, because they're all experts in this department, but for your general viewing audience, it's not enough just to say, oh, I've got business premium, I've got Azure P2, whatever it might be. You have to really know how those things work and configure them. So it's not for these guys, but it's for your general audience.
Agreed, 100%. And I think the same goes to even just like the Defender for endpoint, right? Your premium comes with that built in, but unless you go in through and set the alerting and then actually go through and configure it properly, it'll often be a little more noisy and pain in the hind end than it's going to be helpful as far as time resource sucks. So making sure that you go through and manage that appropriately is critical.
Yep. And everything we've said is part of mitigation.
Yep, it is. These are all control sets that, as you go through, when we talk about, implementing an EDR or that is a control that helps mitigate, risk, right? Unauthorized access or dangerous software running on your machine, that kind of thing. So all that's again back to mitigation. So that being said, I think that I've gone through all like the content. I want to real quick go into the Kamanja platform and I kind of show folks what it looks like to go through and do some of this risk mitigation that we've identified based on some of the risks. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to start sharing. Second. And start sharing this screen. Can you see my screen, Shel?
Yep.
Excellent. So as we talked about before, if you watched the previous sessions, as you're going through your compliance frameworks, we're actually building a risk management platform. We're actually going through and doing an assessment of the infrastructure and environment and processes as we do our checklist. When you get into the results, and I'm just going to do straight risk assessment results here, you can open up. So this is one process that I have in here. Denial of service. Actually, let me do it in that framework because it's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Put it that way. So I have my framework, and we've done our planning stuff. We've gone through and done all the gap analysis, and based on the gap analysis, we've identified some risks, and that's going to be under the do section. So that's going to show up here under your risks and opportunities. You're going to expand that. Here's our 2 risks that we've ingested based on this. Obviously, this is going to be a lot more as you do an entire organization, but we're going to look at Debian for a minute. So the risk that we've identified is breach of information system maintainability, as systems don't log operational activities or problems. What we're going to do is expand that. We can add our risk treatments, and this is completely customizable. As you've added things, you can duplicate those. So if you've added EDR, you can use EDR going forward. But maybe we firewire. What's the word I'm looking for? We VLAN this off onto its own and in segregated access. There's a whole slew of things that we could put in here as far as risk treatment goes. But let's say we Shy hates it that I correct my spelling when we're doing demos because it takes up time, but he's not here, so he can't yell at me. Segregated device. So I'm going to add that item. I can add references if I'd like, and based on the documentation for that, and hit done. And now I've added a risk treatment for this particular device, and I can change this to planned or approved, and we can address this. Oops, pardon me. Approved. We can also add notes or controls, pardon me. So if we want to go in and add the specific framework and what the related control that we're talking about is, we can go ahead and do that. So establish document data flows and what implementation that we're working on here. We can do that as well. We can also add notes to this, so we can track all the things that are going on with specific risk, and then we can set the status for the overall risk to approved. And so we will go through and do that with all the risks that are in that assessment, and then to pull a report for that, we'd go back to our risk management, pull up the associated, go into results, and then pull up the associated assessment, download the report, and all the controls that we've just documented are going to be in here. So here's our risk assessment. This is the first revision of this one. It goes through, gives you a table of contents, the scope, purpose, risk assessment approach, all the heat map definitions, and then it's going to go through all the different risks that we have in there. So we have the threats, the vulnerabilities, the actual risks associated, the likelihood and impact, which gives us our total risk, what we did for risk treatment, and then the residual likelihood, impact, and total risk as well, because we talked about at some point we do have to accept some degree of risk. Each of these, by the way, is, as you're going through the risks, modifiable. So if there is, maybe you don't agree, maybe because we're using some generalities in order to make things easier for our client, our partners. So if you have an idea that maybe this has a little bit higher impact on the business than what we've assessed, or a lower one, you can go through and tweak that as you go through those things. And so then here's your report for your risk. That being said, we're running a little ahead of the schedule here today. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to field those now. Anybody have anything they'd like to chime in with? Any feedback or any questions they have that would like to ping in with? Degley?
I do have a question. So in terms of acceptable level of risk or mitigation for that matter, if one is going through an audit, a third party is making that audit, is there like a rule of thumb or something that will will trigger a passing or a fail on that assessment?
I think it depends very much on the type of assessment that you're going through. Um, I think that if it's going to be a framework mandate like a CMMC, a HIPAA, something along that line, or even a SOC 2 where the rules are predetermined, um, then it's going to be a lot more black and white. Would you agree with that, Shel?
Well, I can speak very specifically for CMMC. If one of the 110 controls is a fail, the whole assessment is a fail. And so there's a lot of importance put on sort of a pre-assessment of some sort and preparation, and then make sure that you don't fail. Now, the cool thing here is within the frameworks and each of the 110 controls, you could actually put notes. Well, that we're kind of in a risky area here. It's trending towards fail because, and put some description there, and then actually put a treatment program in place, a mitigation program in place before you get to an assessment. Assessments are pretty spendy, 30 to 50,000 to start, and if you fail it, you have to pay the fee again. So um, I doubt that Kamanja says, okay, you're going to pass a CMMC assessment, because there's so many things involved in that with scoping and just exactly how an assessor is actually going to look at it. So I don't think Kamanja probably has that built into it, if that's what you're asking, Degley.
Yeah.
But it can certainly give you a place to keep track of things that need attention.
And to add a little bit to that, things like HIPAA requires that you have a plan in place and that you're showing progress towards it. So when it comes down to whether or not you pass or fail an audit, can depend on having just that documentation in some instances. When you're talking about doing internal assessments like CIS or NIST-CSF or something along that line, it's up to you on the cost benefit analysis on whether or not you're willing to accept the risk. But I would say kind of what Shel said in that if it's a third party audited control set that you're going up against, it'll depend on the actual framework that you're using on whether or not there's any gray area whatsoever.
And it depends on the assessor, no matter what the framework.
Right.
There are some that are more lax than others and some that are more strict than others. And so it's a matter of interviewing assessors before you pick one. How do you work with this situation? And you bring up a couple of key questions. How deep do you, for example, for a CMFC assessment, every document has to have some CUI label on it within the document. Well, a client or a subcontractor could have tens of thousands of documents. And is the assessor going to look at every one? How deep are they going to go? Those are questions you need to ask, because the more time they spend, the more expensive the assessment's going to be. So don't just pick an assessor or an auditor out of the blue and say, okay, you're my auditor. Do some shopping. Certainly there's deadlines, but the problem is people wait until the last month or the last week, and now all of a sudden you're way under the gun to get things done, and that's really poor planning.
Right. And so like I said, on the self-assess stuff, I think it's gonna fall down on where your acceptable risk level is, where the client's is, and then literally exactly what Shel said. It depends on the assessment and the assessor on that particular component when you're looking at a third party audited assessment. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, I think that that's going to be a wrap for this session. Look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow at 2. Degley, do you have something else, by the way?
No.
Okay, I saw you come off mute. I want to make sure if we had a question. But yeah, look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow at 2 for the final session. We'll have the illustrious Mark Menzies on tomorrow to.
I'm not attending.
Mark Menzies.
I know. But anyway, you look much less stressed, Darren.
I'm much calmed down. Not just sometimes dealing with the same issue with the same people gets, sorry, just venting, just annoying. But when I spent 2 hours doing something and leaving out a big part of it, but all good now. They've been properly yelled at.
Perfect. All right, guys. Well, again, thank you.